The summer of 1985 was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime for the Hartwell family. David Hartwell, a 42-year-old mechanic from Columbus, Ohio, had been planning this cross-country road trip for months. His wife Linda, 38, had finally convinced him to take their 3 children, 16-year-old Amy, 12-year-old Tommy, and 8-year-old Rebecca, on the vacation they'd been promising for years. The family's powder blue 1982 Chevrolet Suburban was packed to the brim with camping gear, coolers full of food, and enough games and books to keep the kids entertained during the long drive to Yellowstone National Park. The morning of July 15th, neighbors watched as David loaded the last of their belongings into the vehicle. Linda stood on the front porch of their modest 2-story home, checking and rechecking her purse for the 100th time. The children bounced around excitedly, with Rebecca clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit and Tommy arguing with Amy about who got to control the radio during the first leg of the trip. Before we continue with this incredible and haunting story, I'd love for you to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Your support means everything to us. And please, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love connecting with viewers from all around the world. Now let's dive back into the mystery that would haunt investigators for nearly 2 decades. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, the Hartwells' next-door neighbor for over 15 years, was the last person to see them alive. She waved goodbye from her garden as the Suburban pulled out of the driveway at exactly 9:23 a.m. She remembered the time because she'd been listening to her favorite radio program. David honked the horn twice, a tradition he'd established whenever the family went on any trip, and Linda rolled down her window to shout one final goodbye. The first day of their journey went exactly as planned. The family stopped for lunch at a roadside diner in Indiana, where a waitress named Dolores Martinez would later remember serving them. "They seemed so happy," she told investigators years later. The little girl kept asking for extra ketchup for her fries, and the teenage daughter was reading some romance novel. The parents looked tired but content, like they were finally getting the break they deserved. That evening, the Hartwells checked into the Pine Ridge Motel in western Illinois. The desk clerk, a college student named Mark Thompson working his summer job, recalled David paying in cash and asking about the best route to avoid construction delays the next morning. The family occupied rooms 14 and 15, the parents and youngest child in one room, Amy and Tommy in the adjoining room. Several other guests later reported hearing normal family sounds, a television playing, children laughing, and what sounded like David and Linda discussing their route for the following day. The morning of July 16th marked the beginning of a mystery that would consume investigators, devastate a community, and leave more questions than answers for 17 long years. The motel's cleaning staff discovered both rooms empty, with beds that appeared to have been slept in. Personal belongings were scattered throughout the rooms. Linda's makeup bag sat open on the bathroom counter, Tommy's comic books were spread across one bed, and Rebecca's stuffed rabbit lay forgotten on the floor. But the family's suitcases were gone, and so was their Suburban. Initially, the motel staff assumed the Hartwells had simply checked out early to get a head start on their day's driving. It wasn't until David's brother Robert called the motel 3 days later, worried because David hadn't called to check in as promised, that anyone realized something might be wrong. The Illinois State Police were contacted, and within hours, a missing persons report had been filed. Detective Raymond Ray Morrison of the Illinois State Police became the lead investigator on what would become one of the most baffling disappearance cases in the state's history. The initial investigation revealed that the Hartwells had indeed left the motel sometime before dawn on July the 16th. A trucker parked at a rest stop about 30 miles west of the motel remembered seeing a powder blue Suburban with Ohio plates around 5:30 a.m. The driver had gotten out to stretch and check his tires. The man matched David Hartwell's description perfectly. But after that sighting, it was as if the family had simply vanished into thin air, Detective Morrison coordinated search efforts across 3 states. Local law enforcement in Iowa, Nebraska, and Wyoming, the states along the Hartwells' planned route, were all put on alert. The FBI was brought in after a week, classifying the case as a potential kidnapping. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, a veteran investigator with 15 years of experience in missing persons cases, took charge of the federal investigation. She immediately noticed something that troubled her deeply. There were no signs of struggle at the motel, no evidence of foul play, and no demands for ransom. It was as if the family had voluntarily disappeared, but that made no sense given everything she learned about their lives. Back in Columbus, the Hartwell family's disappearance sent shockwaves through their tight-knit community. David had worked at Morrison's Auto Repair for over 12 years and was known as one of the most reliable and honest mechanics in the city. Linda taught 3rd grade at Riverside Elementary School, where she was beloved by students and parents alike. The children were active in their local Methodist church, and Amy had been looking forward to her senior year of high school. Nothing in their background suggested any reason for them to disappear voluntarily. Robert Hartwell, David's younger brother, became the family's advocate and the public face of their desperate search. He organized volunteer search parties, distributed thousands of flyers, and appeared on local television programs pleading for information. "My brother would never just vanish like this," he told reporters. "David was responsible to a fault. He called me every Sunday for 20 years. Something terrible has happened to them." The investigation expanded dramatically as weeks turned into months. Every lead was followed, every possible scenario explored. Police investigated whether David might have been involved in illegal activities, whether the family had enemy, whether they might have witnessed a crime. They examined the family's finances, looking for any indication of money problems that might have led them to start over somewhere else. But every avenue led to a dead end. The Hartwells were exactly what they appeared to be, an ordinary, loving family who had simply vanished without a trace. Months stretched into years, and the case grew cold despite the tireless efforts of Detective Morrison and Agent Walsh. They never stopped believing they would find answers, but the trail had gone completely cold. The last confirmed sighting remained that trucker's glimpse of the Suburban at the rest stop. It was as if the earth had opened up and swallowed the entire family whole. By 1990, 5 years after the disappearance, the active investigation had been scaled back significantly. Detective Morrison had retired, haunted by his inability to solve the case that had consumed him for half a decade. Agent Walsh had been transferred to another field office, but she kept copies of all the case files and continued to follow up on any new leads that trickled in. Robert Hartwell refused to give up hope, continuing to search and keeping his family's story alive in the media whenever possible. The case remained a source of fascination for amateur investigators and true crime enthusiasts, but professional law enforcement had largely moved on to more recent cases with better prospects for resolution. The Hartwell family had become another tragic statistic, another unsolved mystery in the files of multiple law enforcement agencies. Their house in Columbus sat empty for years, too painful for Robert to sell, but too expensive to maintain. Eventually, he was forced to put it on the market, and it was purchased by a young family who knew nothing of its history. As the 1990s progressed, the case was rarely mentioned, except on the anniversaries of the disappearance, when local news stations would run brief updates noting that the family remained missing and asking anyone with information to come forward. But by then, most people assumed the worst, that the Hartwells were dead, victims of some terrible crime that would never be solved. The community had grieved, moved on, and largely forgotten about the family that had simply driven away one summer morning and never been seen again. It was against this backdrop of resignation and fading hope that an extraordinary discovery would emerge in 2002, 17 years after the family's disappearance. Margaret Thompson, a retired librarian from Denver, Colorado, had spent her golden years pursuing a hobby that had become an obsession, collecting and cataloging vintage postcards and photographs from small towns across America. She frequented estate sales, antique shops, and flea markets, always searching for unique pieces to add to her collection. On a warm Saturday morning in June 2002, Margaret was browsing through boxes of old photographs at an estate sale in Golden, Colorado, a small town about 20 miles west of Denver. The sale was being held at the former home of Herman Kowalski, an elderly man who had passed away the previous month. According to his neighbors, Herman had been something of a recluse in his later years, rarely leaving his house and having no known relatives. The contents of his home were being sold to settle his estate. Margaret was drawn to a particular box of photographs that seemed to contain images from the 1980s and early 1990s. Most were standard tourist shots, mountains, lakes, roadside attractions. But buried deep in the box, she found something that would change everything, a color photograph that appeared to have been taken at some kind of outdoor event or gathering. The image was slightly blurry, as if taken from a distance, but it clearly showed a group of people standing near what looked like food vendors or carnival booths. What caught Margaret's attention wasn't the scene itself, but something she spotted in the background of the photograph. Parked among other vehicles was a powder blue Chevrolet Suburban with what appeared to be Ohio license plates. But more striking still were the people standing near the vehicle, a family group consisting of 2 adults and 3 children. Even in the slightly out-of-focus image, there was something about the family that seemed familiar to Margaret, though she couldn't quite place why. Margaret purchased the entire box of photographs for $5 and took them home to examine more carefully. Using a magnifying glass and good lighting, she studied the image of the family more closely. The man appeared to be middle-aged, with dark hair and a stocky build. The woman was slender, with shoulder-length brown hair. There were 3 children, a teenage girl, a boy who looked to be about middle school age, and a much younger girl who couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. Something about the photograph nagged at Margaret, a feeling that she had seen these faces before. It took her several days of thinking before she remembered where. Years earlier, she had seen a television documentary about unsolved missing persons cases, and one of the featured families had looked remarkably similar to the people in the photograph. That evening, Margaret went to her local library and began researching missing family cases from the 1980s. It didn't take long for her to find what she was looking for. The Hartwell family disappearance had been featured in several true crime books and television programs over the years, and their photographs were readily available online. Margaret's heart raced as she compared the images. While the photograph from the estate sale was not crystal clear, the resemblance was undeniable. The family structure was identical: 2 parents and 3 children of the right approximate ages. More importantly, the vehicle in the background matched both the color and model of the Hartwell family's Suburban. But there was something else in the photograph that made Margaret's discovery even more significant. In the background, partially visible behind the food vendors, was a banner or sign that read "Annual Pine Valley Days Festival." Margaret immediately began researching this festival and discovered that Pine Valley was a small community in rural Wyoming, hundreds of miles from where the Hartwell family was last known to have been seen. Margaret knew she had potentially found something incredibly important. The photograph appeared to have been taken sometime in the mid to late 1980s, based on the clothing styles and vehicle models visible in the image. If this really was the Hartwell family, it meant they had survived whatever had happened to them in Illinois and had somehow made their way to Wyoming. But why? And what had happened to them after this photograph was taken? Unsure of how to proceed, Margaret contacted the FBI field office in Denver. She was eventually connected with Agent Sarah Rodriguez, a specialist in cold cases. Margaret explained her discovery and offered to bring the photograph to the FBI office for examination. Agent Rodriguez was initially skeptical. Over the years, the Bureau had received dozens of tips about possible Hartwell sightings, all of which had turned out to be false leads. But something about Margaret's detailed description and the specificity of the location intrigued her enough to agree to meet. 2 days later, Margaret sat in Agent Rodriguez's office as the photograph was examined under high-powered magnification and compared with known images of the Hartwell family. The results were intriguing but inconclusive. The physical characteristics of the people in the photograph were consistent with the Hartwells, and the vehicle was definitely a powder blue Chevrolet Suburban with what appeared to be Ohio license plates. However, the image quality was not sufficient to make a definitive identification. Agent Rodriguez decided to pursue the lead despite the uncertainty. She contacted law enforcement in Wyoming and learned that the Pine Valley Days Festival had indeed been held annually during the 1980s, typically in late July or early August. The festival had been discontinued in the early 1990s when Pine Valley's population declined and many local businesses closed. Agent Rodriguez arranged to travel to Wyoming to investigate further. Pine Valley, Wyoming, proved to be exactly the kind of place where a family might disappear without attracting much attention. Located in a remote valley surrounded by mountains, the town had once been a thriving mining community, but had been in steady decline since the 1970s. By the 1980s, fewer than 800 people called Pine Valley home, and many of those were elderly residents who had lived there their entire lives. It was the kind of place where newcomers were noticed, but not necessarily questioned, especially during the busy summer festival season when temporary workers and visitors were common. Agent Rodriguez spent 3 days in Pine Valley, interviewing longtime residents and searching through what few records from the 1980s still existed. The local newspaper had ceased publication in 1989, and many of the businesses from that era were long gone. However, she did find several people who remembered the annual festival and were willing to look at the photograph. The breakthrough came when Agent Rodriguez showed the photograph to Martha Williams, an 82-year-old woman who had operated a crafts booth at the Pine Valley Days Festival for over 15 years. Martha studied the image carefully before nodding slowly. "I think I remember them," she said. "A family with Ohio plates. They weren't from around here, that's for sure. The man asked me about work opportunities in the area, said they were thinking about making a fresh start somewhere quiet." Martha's recollection was vague but tantalizing. She remembered the family spending several days in Pine Valley during the 1985 festival, camping at the local RV park and attending most of the festival events. The man had inquired about jobs at the local mine, which was still operating at that time, though at reduced capacity. Martha recalled that the woman seemed nervous or worried about something, though she couldn't remember any specific details about their conversation. This information sent Agent Rodriguez's investigation in an entirely new direction. If Martha Williams was correct, and if the family in the photograph really was the Hartwells, it suggested that their disappearance had not been the result of foul play, at least not initially. Instead, it appeared they might have intentionally traveled to Wyoming for reasons that were still unclear. But what had happened to them after the festival, and why had they never contacted their family in Ohio? Agent Rodriguez expanded her investigation to include employment records from the Pine Valley mine and registration records from the RV park. The mine's personnel files from 1985 were incomplete, but she did find a notation about a man named Dave who had inquired about work but had not been hired due to lack of mining experience. The RV park records were more detailed and showed that a family matching the Hartwells' description had stayed there for 6 days during the festival week of 1985. The most significant discovery came when Agent Rodriguez interviewed Frank Morrison, the former manager of the Pine Valley RV Park. Morrison, now 71 and living in retirement in nearby Jackson, had a remarkably clear memory of the Ohio family. They paid in cash for 6 nights, he recalled. The man seemed decent enough, but there was something about their situation that didn't sit right with me. They had nice camping gear, but they acted like people who were running from something. The kids seemed happy enough, but the parents were always looking over their shoulders. Morrison's most important recollection was that the family had not left Pine Valley after the festival ended, as he had expected. Instead, they had moved their campsite to a more remote location outside of town, on public land near an abandoned mining claim. Morrison had seen them several times that autumn when he made trips to check on some cattle that grazed in the area. The last time he had seen them was in early October 1985, just before the first winter snow. This revelation opened up an entirely new phase of the investigation. If Frank Morrison was correct, the Hartwell family had spent at least 3 months living in the Wyoming wilderness, far from any town or established community. Agent Rodriguez coordinated with local search and rescue teams to explore the area around the abandoned mining claim that Morrison had described. The search area was vast and challenging, covering dozens of square miles of rugged mountain terrain. Much of the landscape had changed over the 17 years since 1985, with new forest growth, natural erosion, and the effects of multiple harsh winters. Any campsite or temporary structures from that time period would likely have been destroyed or completely overgrown by now. After a week of intensive searching, the team made a discovery that would provide both answers and new mysteries. In the sheltered valley, about 8 miles from Pine Valley, they found the remains of what had clearly been a long-term campsite. The site included the rusted remains of camping equipment, some personal items that had somehow survived the elements, and most significantly, the skeletal remains of the Hartwell family's Chevrolet Suburban. The vehicle had been stripped of anything valuable and had obviously been abandoned for many years. However, investigators were able to confirm through the vehicle identification number that it was indeed the Suburban that David Hartwell had purchased in Ohio in 1982. Inside the vehicle, they found additional personal items that clearly belonged to the Hartwell family, including Amy's high school class ring and Rebecca's stuffed rabbit, now barely recognizable after years of exposure to the elements. But the discovery that would haunt investigators for years to come was what they didn't find at the campsite: any trace of the Hartwell family themselves. There were no human remains, no clothing, no indication of what had happened to David, Linda, Amy, Tommy, and Rebecca. The campsite showed evidence of having been used for an extended period, but it appeared to have been abandoned suddenly, with many personal belongings left behind. The investigation into this remote campsite revealed a story that was both heartbreaking and mysterious. Through careful examination of the surviving evidence, investigators were able to piece together at least part of what had happened to the Hartwells after they arrived in Wyoming. They had indeed spent several months living in the wilderness, apparently trying to start over completely away from their previous life in Ohio. Dr. Emily Chen, a forensic anthropologist brought in to analyze the site, determined that the family had constructed a fairly elaborate temporary settlement. They had built a fire ring, created storage areas protected from the weather, and even attempted to establish a small garden area. This wasn't a short-term camping situation, Dr. Chen explained. These people were trying to establish a permanent homestead, completely off the grid. The evidence suggested that the Hartwells had been living at the site from sometime in August 1985 through at least early winter, which matched Frank Morrison's recollections. But then something had caused them to abandon everything and disappear once again. The abrupt nature of their departure was evident in the personal items left behind, not just Rebecca's stuffed animal, but also family photographs, Linda's jewelry, and David's tools. Agent Rodriguez faced a frustrating situation. After 17 years, she had finally found concrete evidence of what had happened to the Hartwell family after their disappearance from Illinois. They had survived, had made their way to Wyoming, and had attempted to build a new life in complete isolation. But their ultimate fate remained as mysterious as ever. What had forced them to abandon their campsite so suddenly? Where had they gone? And were they still alive somewhere? The discovery in Wyoming generated significant media attention, bringing the Hartwell case back into the public eye for the first time in years. Robert Hartwell, now 58 years old, traveled to Wyoming to see the campsite for himself. Standing among the ruins of his brother's attempt at a new life, he was overwhelmed with conflicting emotions. "At least now I know they survived the initial disappearance," he told reporters. "But I still don't understand why they never contacted me, why they felt they had to run away from everything they knew." The investigation continued for several more months, with agents following every possible lead and theory. They explored the possibility that the family had been forced to leave by criminal activity in the area, that they had fallen victim to the harsh Wyoming winter, or that they had simply moved on to yet another location to continue their nomadic existence. Search teams combed hundreds of square miles of wilderness, looking for any additional evidence of the family's presence. One of the most intriguing theories emerged when investigators learned about a network of people who had chosen to live completely off the grid in remote areas of the American West during the 1980s. These individuals and families had deliberately severed all ties with mainstream society, often for reasons related to government distrust, religious beliefs, or simply a desire to live a simpler, more isolated life. Some had established hidden communities in the wilderness, supporting each other while maintaining complete secrecy about their locations and identities. Could the Hartwell family have connected with such a group? It would explain their ability to survive in the wilderness for months, their sudden departure from the campsite, and their continued absence from official records. Agent Rodriguez interviewed several former members of these off-grid communities, but none could provide any specific information about a family matching the Hartwells' description. As 2003 arrived, the investigation once again began to lose momentum. Despite the dramatic discovery in Wyoming, investigators were no closer to determining the current whereabouts or fate of the Hartwell family. The case had generated dozens of new tips and possible sightings, but none had led to concrete evidence. Agent Rodriguez continued to follow up on leads as they came in, but she was increasingly skeptical that the family would ever be found. The story might have ended there, with the mystery of the Hartwells' ultimate fate joining the countless other unsolved disappearances in American law enforcement files. But 18 months later, in the summer of 2004, a discovery in a completely different part of the country would provide the final piece of the puzzle and bring closure to one of the most baffling missing persons cases of the 1980s. Thomas Mitchell, a building contractor from Portland, Oregon, was renovating an old farmhouse about 60 miles east of the city when he made a discovery that would solve the Hartwell mystery once and for all. The farmhouse had been abandoned for over a decade, and Mitchell had purchased it as part of a larger development project. While cleaning out the basement, he found a metal box hidden behind a false wall. Inside the box were documents that would finally explain what had happened to the missing Ohio family. The box contained a detailed journal written by David Hartwell, covering the period from July 1985 through March 1987. The journal told a story that was both tragic and ultimately redemptive, explaining not only why the family had disappeared, but also revealing their fate after they abandoned the Wyoming campsite. David's entries revealed that the family's disappearance had been voluntary, though not by choice. According to the journal, David had discovered that he had been unknowingly involved in a money laundering operation through his auto repair shop in Ohio. A customer who regularly brought expensive cars for service had been using David's shop as a front for processing stolen vehicles. When David realized what was happening and confronted the customer, he was threatened with violence against his family if he reported the illegal activity to authorities. Terrified for his wife and children's safety, David had made the desperate decision to take his family and disappear completely. The planned vacation to Yellowstone provided the perfect cover for their escape. David had been secretly preparing for months, gradually converting their savings to cash and researching remote locations where they could start over without leaving a paper trail. The journal entries from their time in Wyoming revealed a family struggling to adapt to an incredibly difficult situation. While the children initially thought they were on an extended camping adventure, Linda had known the truth from the beginning and was consumed with worry about their future. David worked desperately to establish some kind of permanent shelter before winter, but his lack of wilderness survival skills made the task nearly impossible. As autumn turned to winter in 1985, the situation became critical. The family was running low on food and supplies, and David realized that they would not survive a Wyoming winter in their makeshift camp. In December, they were forced to abandon their campsite and seek help from other people living off the grid in the region. This connected them with a network of families who had also chosen to disappear from mainstream society for various reasons. David's journal revealed that they had spent the next year and a half moving between different hidden communities throughout the Mountain West, never staying in one place for more than a few months. The constant movement was exhausting, especially for the children, who struggled to understand why they couldn't contact their friends or return to their normal lives. Amy, in particular, became increasingly rebellious and depressed as she realized that her senior year of high school and all her future plans had been completely derailed. The final entries in David's journal, dated March 1987, revealed that the family had finally found a more permanent solution to their situation. Through the off-grid network, they had connected with a family in Oregon who operated a small organic farm and were willing to take them in. David, Linda, and the children were given new identities and became part of an extended family that included several other people who had chosen to disappear from their previous lives. The journal's last entry was both heartbreaking and hopeful. "We will never be the Hartwells again, but maybe we can finally have some peace. The children deserve a chance at normal lives, even if they have to live them under different names. I know Robert will never forgive me for not trusting him with the truth, but I couldn't risk the criminals finding us through him. Maybe someday, if we're ever truly safe, we can find a way to let him know we survived." Thomas Mitchell immediately contacted the FBI with his discovery. Agent Rodriguez, who had never completely given up on the case, flew to Oregon within 24 hours of receiving the call. The farmhouse where the journal had been found was located on property that had indeed been operated as an organic farm during the late 1980s and early 1990s. The property had changed hands several times since then, and its current owners knew nothing about its history. The investigation into the Oregon connection revealed a fascinating subculture that had existed largely beneath the radar of law enforcement. The organic farm had been operated by a couple named William and Sarah Foster, who had themselves left mainstream society in the early 1980s. The Fosters had created a kind of informal witness protection program for people who needed to disappear for legitimate reasons, but couldn't or wouldn't go through official channels. Over a period of about 15 years, the Fosters had helped dozens of individuals and families establish new identities and start over completely. Most were people fleeing domestic violence, criminal threats, or other dangerous situations. The Fosters provided temporary shelter, helped forge necessary documents, and connected people with others who had successfully transitioned to new lives. William Foster had died in 1998, and Sarah had moved to a retirement community in California. When Agent Rodriguez located and interviewed her, the 78-year-old woman was initially reluctant to discuss her activities from the 1980s. However, when she learned about the extent of the investigation and the family's story, she became more cooperative. Sarah Foster confirmed that a family matching the Hartwells' description had indeed stayed on their farm from the spring of 1987 through the early 1990s. She remembered them as hard-working and grateful, though clearly struggling with the emotional toll of their situation. The children had been enrolled in a small local school under their new identities, and David had worked on the farm while Linda helped Sarah with various domestic tasks. According to Sarah, the family had left Oregon in 1992 or 1993 when David felt they were finally safe enough to venture out on their own again. Sarah had lost touch with them after their departure and had assumed they had successfully integrated into mainstream society somewhere under their new identities. She provided Agent Rodriguez with the assumed names the family had been using, though she cautioned that they had likely changed them again after leaving Oregon. With this new information, Agent Rodriguez was able to trace the family's movements after they left the Foster farm. Using the assumed names and the time frame Sarah Foster had provided, she discovered records showing that a family matching their description had settled in Northern California in 1993. David had found work as a mechanic, his original trade, while Linda had eventually returned to teaching. The trail led to the small city of Eureka, California, where Agent Rodriguez made contact with local law enforcement. Within days, she had located the family that had once been known as the Hartwells. They were living under the names David and Linda Matthews, with their children now going by Ashley, Michael, and Jennifer Matthews. Amy was now 33 years old and working as a nurse. Tommy was 29 and employed as a park ranger, and Rebecca was 25 and teaching elementary school like her mother. The reunion between Agent Rodriguez and the former Hartwell family was emotional and complicated. After nearly 20 years of living under assumed identities, they had built successful new lives but had never forgotten their origins or the family they had been forced to leave behind. David, now 59, was initially terrified that his family's safety would be compromised by the discovery. However, Agent Rodriguez was able to assure him that the original criminal threats from Ohio were no longer relevant. The money laundering operation had been shut down years earlier, and most of the people involved were either dead or in prison. The most difficult aspect of the situation was the family's relationship with Robert Hartwell, David's brother, who had never stopped searching for them. When Agent Rodriguez contacted Robert with the news that his brother's family had been found alive, his reaction was a mixture of joy, relief, and deep hurt. "I understand why David felt he had to protect his family," Robert said, "but it breaks my heart that he didn't trust me enough to help them. We could have figured something out together." Ashley. The first phone call between David and Robert in nearly 20 years was arranged by Agent Rodriguez and took place in December 2004. Both brothers were overcome with emotion, and it took several conversations before they were able to move past the hurt and misunderstanding that had built up over the decades. Robert was particularly moved when he learned about the hardships his brother's family had endured, and David was devastated to learn about all the time and money Robert had spent searching for them. The reunion between the extended family was gradual and carefully managed. Amy, Tommy, and Rebecca, now known as Ashley, Michael, and Jennifer, had complex feelings about reconnecting with their Ohio relatives. They had clear memories of their childhood as the Hartwells, but they had also built strong identities as the Matthews family. The process of reintegrating these two parts of their lives would take years of counseling and careful communication. One of the most poignant moments came when Rebecca, now 25, was reunited with the stuffed rabbit that had been found at the Wyoming campsite. The deteriorated toy had been preserved as evidence, and seeing it again brought back powerful memories of her childhood and the night her family had fled Ohio. "I remember crying for that rabbit for months after we had to leave it behind," she said. "I never understood why we couldn't go back for it." The Hartwell case officially closed in early 2005, nearly 20 years after the family's initial disappearance. The resolution was bittersweet. While the family had survived and ultimately thrived, they had paid an enormous emotional price for their safety. The children had missed out on normal teenage years, college experiences, and the chance to maintain relationships with extended family and childhood friends. David and Linda, now in their 60s, struggled with guilt over the choices they had made and the pain they had caused their loved ones. However, they also recognized that they had successfully protected their children from serious harm and had managed to build good lives despite impossible circumstances. Their story became a testament to the power of family bonds and the lengths parents will go to protect their children. The discovery of the Hartwell family also shed light on the underground networks that had helped people disappear during the 1980s and 1990s. Agent Rodriguez's investigation revealed that hundreds, possibly thousands of individuals had successfully vanished from their previous lives during this period, often with the help of organizations like the Foster's Farm. While some of these disappearances were motivated by criminal activity, many others involved people who felt they had no other choice for protecting themselves and their families. Today, the members of the former Hartwell family continue to live in California under their adopted names, though they have gradually re-established contact with their Ohio relatives. The process of rebuilding relationships has been slow and sometimes difficult, but both sides of the family have worked hard to bridge the decades of separation. Robert Hartwell, now in his 70s, travels to California several times a year to visit his brother's family, and has developed close relationships with his nieces and nephew. The case remains one of the most unusual and complex missing persons investigations in FBI history, demonstrating both the limitations of traditional investigative methods and the power of persistence in seeking the truth. Agent Rodriguez, who retired in 2010, considers the Hartwell case one of the most rewarding of her career, not just because it was solved, but because it ultimately had a happy ending for everyone involved. The photograph that Margaret Thompson discovered at that estate sale in Colorado in 2002 now sits in the FBI's files as evidence in one of their most remarkable solved cases. Without her curiosity and persistence, the Hartwell family's story might never have been uncovered, and a brother's 20-year search for his missing family might never have found resolution. It serves as a reminder that sometimes the most important discoveries come from the most unexpected places, and that hope should never be completely abandoned, even when cases seem utterly hopeless.